This absolutely beautiful spot in downtown Dunedin is Lan Yuan, Dunedin's Chinese garden. It's an amazing echo of the beauty of Chinese culture. But Dunedin's almost 10,000 kilometres from mainland China, so why is there a Chinese garden in the heart of Dunedin? And why does Otago seem to have such amazingly strong links historically with China? My name's Sean Brosnan. Come with me as I discover this rich Chinese heritage on the journey to Lan Yuan.
Much of the early story of the Chinese plays out around the rugged and remote areas of central Otago. But the story of why these sojourners came to Otago begins many miles away during a turbulent era for southern China.
Now, you might not expect to find a Catholic French cathedral in the middle of a Chinese city, but here we have one of the great landmarks of Guangzhou, Sacred Heart Cathedral, built by the French in the 19th century when this was known as Canton. And it's a reminder of how this part of China uniquely has a long-standing connection with overseas countries going back hundreds and hundreds of years, but very important in the mid-19th century as a precursor to the diasporic exodus of so many gold seekers from this area. Imagine a great power. They went to another country and said, look, you're going to have to accept this hard, addictive drug as our major trade commodity. Well, that's what happened between Britain and China in the 1840s. And here in Guangzhou City, Chinese officials tried to stop the importation of opium from the British, and the British went to war to force them to accept opium. Beginning of the Opium Wars, at the very time when in New Zealand we had the sign of the Treaty of Waitangi, here in Guangdong it was war over opium. Now, the consequences of the Opium Wars for Guangdong and Guangzhou were profound, led to economic dislocation, downturn in social and economic life. There were revolts and rebellions, there were clan wars, there was famine, there was drought. And in short, it was the beginning of Chinese century of humiliations. It all began here in the 1840s and went on for years, such that so many places in the countryside here were terrible places to live, faced all sorts of difficulties, and the men had to go elsewhere to try and improve things back home. And all of that disruption, dislocation that first prompted Cantonese to go seeking gold in California in 1850 drew them next here to Australia, to Victoria, and to Bendigo, which they called Daigomsan, the big gold mountain, because this was indeed the richest gold field in the world for many, many years. At its peak, there were as many as 46,000 Chinese on the Victorian Goldfields in 1859. A much smaller number, of course, came over to Otago, but the connection with Australia is critical to the beginning of our Chinese story, because it was from places like Bendigo and Ballarat that first flow of Cantonese first came to investigate New Zealand, Otago, discover its riches, and thereafter the direct link with Guangdong was established. But the Victorian flow came first. So some of the earliest Otago Chinese originally lived here at the Ironbark Camp in Bendigo. For the first 3 years of the Chinese presence in Otago, most of those were coming from here or Ballarat, making their way down to Melbourne, across the sea to Otago, perhaps as many as 3,000 in that 3-year period. And these guys were veteran gold miners. They knew how to operate amongst Europeans. They'd done the hard yards here, learned a lot of lessons, which is probably why they did so well in those early years. Fitted in, didn't make too much of a nuisance for themselves, and didn't stir up too much anti-Chinese feeling in that first period, and were successful as gold miners as well, getting the money they needed to go back to China.
An estimated 180,000 Cantonese left China in search of gold during the second half of the 19th century. They were exclusively male, and they aimed to get back home after about 5 years' work abroad with adequate money to support their families through the tough times at home. While the biggest destination for Chinese gold seekers was California, by 1858 over 42,000 Cantonese were hard at work on the Victorian Goldfields of Australia.
Gold was first discovered here at Ballarat in Victoria, Australia in 1851, but the peak of the gold rush was around 1858, and by then there were 10,000 or more Cantonese Chinese gold seekers here. They made up a quarter of all the gold seekers here at Ballarat, second only among the ethnic groups to the English. But today in Ballarat there's not a sign of that Chinese presence, apart from the recreations at Sovereign Hill and the graves in various cemeteries, many of which are empty. And it was from here at Ballarat and at Bendigo that so many of the first Chinese came to Otago between 1866 and 1871.
But transferring from the Victorian to the Otago goldfields was not a simple process. In fact, most of the Cantonese miners had never heard of New Zealand, let alone Otago. But events in that far-off corner of the world would soon change the course of Otago history.
This is where it all began. In May 1861, a Tasmanian gold miner by the name of Gabriel Reed was prospecting here in the Tuapeka Creek, and he came across the first payable goldfield in New Zealand. The rush began. People streamed in here from all across the world, particularly from across the Tasman. And Otago's fortunes were transformed. It became the most prosperous province in New Zealand. But just 3 years later, the golden times seemed to be over. New fields were discovered on the west coast, and so many of the miners looking for the new El Dorado set off for there, not to come back to Otago at all. There was a crisis. No men to work the goldfields. What were they to do? The gold connection between Dunedin and Victoria was very marked in the early 1860s. So many of Dunedin's leading businessmen had spent long periods in Australia before they came here. And it was one of them, William Tolmie, a Scot from the Isle of Skye, who had gone to Victoria as a 20-year-old, worked as a banker there for 12 years, then in 1864 come over here to Dunedin as a partner in the merchant firm of Dalgety, Rattray & Co. A big friend of William Larnock, who also had that Victorian background. And it was Tolmie and his colleagues in the Dunedin Chamber of Commerce who first came up with the idea to invite Chinese from Victoria over to Otago to solve the crisis on the goldfields, the lack of labour. If they could get those Chinese miners in Victoria to come over here, all would be solved. So going through the Chamber of Commerce, which met in the old Athenaeum building here on the site now occupied by Cagey House. Now this stretch of Princess Street behind me, occupied now by the Distinction Hotel, the old Chief Post Office, this is where the old Otago Provincial Government buildings were in 1865. They hadn't yet built their big flash provincial council building, but there was a ramshackle row of offices, and that's where they met. Now that was the centre of political power in Otago. That's where all things to do with the goldfields were decided. And when the Chamber of Commerce came down the hill from the Athenaeum, that's where they took their petition to the provincial government to send an invitation over Victoria and begin that process of Chinese coming here to labour on the goldfields and resuscitate Otago's gold-driven fortunes. Now that is just so important to the nature of Chinese history in Otago in New Zealand. It differentiates us from California, from Victoria, that the Chinese came at the invitation of the political power in the place.
And so the invitation was made. But convincing the Chinese to leave the bountiful Victorian fields was not an easy task.
Now, it was all very well and good having this bright idea to invite Chinese miners from Victoria to come to Otago, but how are you going to get the word to them? They didn't speak English, couldn't read and write. So you could put a poster up or you could advertise in the newspapers, but it wouldn't work. So the answer really lay here in Melbourne's Chinatown, in Little Bourke Street, where already by that point there were dozens of Chinese merchants. And the Chinese merchants, the leadership cadre, that was the answer, getting the word out to the miners, to recruit them to make the bid to come to Otago. And the biggest and most important of the merchants was Lo Kong Meng. Now, Lo Kong Meng was no ordinary Chinese. He had actually been born in Penang, Malaya, a British colony, and he went through a British education there. His roots were in Penyu, same area in fact as Choi Siu Hoi, and they were associated here in the late 1850s in Melbourne. His premises were just around the corner in Little Bourke Street. They don't survive anymore. But by the time the Otago invitation came here in 1866, Lo Kong Meng dominated trade routes across the Pacific back to Hong Kong. He was the bee's knees. He was the wealthiest, most influential merchant in Melbourne. Ideally placed to both consider the Otago invitation and to act as a conduit to the miners and to help them get to Otago. There was no better person with whom the Otago representatives could deal than Lo Kong Meng. So Lo Kong Meng and the other Chinese merchants didn't just jump at the offer to go to Otago. They considered it carefully, probably here in the Samyup Society's building that Lo Kong Meng had constructed. It was already here by 1863. So in late 1865, that offer was on the table and the merchants came up with a set of demands for the Otago representatives. Firstly, there were to be no additional regulations imposing taxes on the Chinese different to everybody else. Secondly, there was to be no physical attacks or vilification of the Chinese, such as they'd experienced so much here in Victoria. And thirdly, they were to be considered equal with Europeans before the law. And on the basis of that, when those guarantees were made, they considered sending an advance party over to Otago to check the scene out. So Lo Kong Meng sent his agent, another Anglophone Chinese from the Melbourne community, Ho Ah Mi. He came over here in December 1865 to check the scene out. He brought back a positive report and then began to recruit the first party of Chinese miners who then came over from Victoria, landed at the wharf, which was further inland than it is now. A lot of reclamation has gone on. It's about where the Jetty Street overbridge was. The wharves were there. That's where they got off. The first Chinese party would have attracted a lot of attention from people on the bustling Dunedin waterfront, up to Princes Street, grub stakes set up, and then off inland. And all the Chinese that followed, both from Victoria through the 1860s and 70s, and then those that came directly from China from 1871 on. They would have come in their big ships to Port Chalmers, then got on to the small steamers like the Golden Age, which have brought them up the harbour there to the wharves, and off they would have got. A bustling scene here on the waterfront, quite exotic, the Chinese amongst all the other people wandering about the place, up to Princes Street, and then off inland to begin their journey into the Otago hinterland in search of gold in the New Gold Mountain.
Initially, the Cantonese miners kept themselves in distinct county groups. Men from the Siyup counties came from 4 distinct areas in southwest Guangdong province. Men from the Samyup counties, on the other hand, came from the 3 counties that surround the city of Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou. In Otago, these Chinese used their clan and county networks to support them through their gold-seeking days. On the 22nd of February 1866, the first group of Samyup miners, 12 of them, arrived at Waitahuna. They had with them an American wagon full of their gear, and they were all set to go. Camped there overnight, presented their credentials, a letter of introduction from Vincent Pike, the Goldfields Commissioner, to the local gold warden. Next morning, a mining agent named Duncan Campbell brought them up here, Slaughterhouse Gully. Some auriferous ground, that's gold-bearing ground owned by a Dunedin gentleman, as the newspaper reports, was provided to them, and they began work. And the first impressions of this first group of Chinese miners was published in the local newspaper. They seemed to be a quiet, peaceably disposed class of men, averaging from 18 to 30 years of age. And although their gibberish sounded a little strange, there was nothing in their general demeanour that could be called downright repulsive.
6 from one village, 10 from another, some from neighbouring villages. They formed parties.
Now, the first exploratory groups of Chinese miners came over from Victoria in December 1865, and they came on the same ship, but they represented different groupings. When they arrived in Dunedin, they split up. The Samyup men went in a clockwise direction through Milton and Manuka Gorge and up towards Lawrence, and they started their work at Weatherston's Slaughterhouse Gully. The Siyup men, on the other hand, they went in an anti-clockwise direction up to Waikaiti, Palmerston, Shag Valley through the Pig Route, and they were taken to a spot somewhere near here on Hills Creek. We've got Blackstone Hill behind me. It's somewhere around this area. We don't know exactly where it was, but that's where they began work, and they were followed up soon after by other parties who came to join them. And the two groups continued to go in that different directional split for quite some time. Eventually they overlapped, but throughout their time in Otago here, although Europeans saw them as being Chinese, the Chinese didn't think of themselves in that way at all. They thought of themselves in much smaller county-specific groupings and had that sense of identity to their home villages, to their clan groupings, much smaller units of identity. They never spoke with one voice as Chinese. So it's really important to remember that as we trace their journey, and we keep thinking of them as the Chinese. They didn't think of themselves that way, only the Europeans did. This is the site of the Lawrence Chinese camp, the first of a number of such camps that were established in Otago as the base for Chinese mining communities. This was the first and the largest, and really it's the most important historic spot for gold mining in the Chinese part of our history. It flourished particularly in the 1870s when there were about 1,000 Chinese miners in the area around the Tuapeka here. It never had a very big resident population, but people would come in here on a regular basis, and it was a thriving hub of Chinese communal life. And it was also the site of the leadership cadre in the early period, and from here the invitations went back to Guangdong, to the home village, from the leaders in this camp, and they began that really important expansion in the Chinese population in 1871-72, which peaked with over 4,000 Chinese gold miners in the Otago area here. In 1870, the Lawrence men decided to boldly go for 2,000 more coming directly from Guangdong. Now, the men there were mostly from the upper Purniu area, but they threw the scheme open to men from other counties as well, so they could send home for their people. With all the arrivals coming in 1871 and 72, the number of Otago's Chinese miners peaked in that year at just over 4,000. And of course they spread right throughout the province, but they weren't all going to the same places. For instance, here at Shepherd's Creek, just above Bannockburn, there was a store run by Li Ah-ming, and he catered for men from his county, which was Zhong Seng. Very particular county groupings were going to particular places and congregating and supporting each other together.
Thus, the goldfields of Otago became populated with Chinese. Their teamwork and ingenuity was to contribute to another economic boom across the province and send many men back to China with small fortunes.